Welcome back to Opus Elenae. Things have been pretty busy around here, having two bigger projects back to back. Unfortunately, I did not win the Halloween costume contest, but that's okay. I had a lot of fun making this shirt and just generally being inspired to make something at all. Do make sure that you go to the 2020 entrance page over on Matthew's Modern Maker website and check out all of the other entries. They're amazing. Today is the second video in my quest for Viking outerwear. When I wove my silk trim, link in the card and also in the description box below, I talked about how this was going to be a very speculative, historically adequate project for a bunch of reasons. I guess now is the time to unpack all that, but first, a quick PSA. White supremacists have a terrible habit of co-opting and misinterpreting Viking imagery and history in an attempt to support and justify their own racism and nationalism. This is, of course, absolute drivel. I condemn that kind of revisionist hijacking categorically, and I will have none of it on my channel or in my space. So, if you've come here looking for more Nazi talking points or something to support your white supremacist propaganda, you can see yourself right out the f***ing door. Where were we? Oh right, unpacking. Item 1, the fiber. I did a burn test on this fabric and it is absolutely a plant-based fiber, probably cotton. Norse people in what's commonly referred to as the Viking Age, approximately 800 AD to 1066 AD, wore linen undergarments, but almost all of the finds of outer clothing have been wool and wool trimmed with silk. Cotton wasn't even a thing in Europe until the 12th century, and even if it was, it doesn't insulate well, it holds onto water, gets incredibly heavy, and doesn't breathe or insulate when wet. Nothing leads me to believe that the Vikings would have chosen cotton for their outerwear had it been available to them. Item 2, the weave. Not only is the fiber incorrect, but the weave structure is as well. There are several Viking examples of twill weave fabric. Twill being a weave structure where the weft threads pass over one or more warp threads and then under one or more warp threads, forming a pattern of diagonal ribs. Denim, like your jeans, is a twill weave. Twill can be woven in such a way that they form continuous diagonals, herringbones, chevrons, or even diamonds. But the diamond patterns found at Hedeby, Birka, and York are a broken diamond, and not one like this particular fabric of mine. Item 3. The trim. While narrow wear trim was absolutely known of in the Viking era, it was generally tablet woven with some kind of design, or else woven with metallic threads in a brocade. Silk trim for clothing was more commonly cut in strips from a larger piece of cloth and then either treated like bias binding over the edges of garments, or else sewn down flat with the raw edges turned under. Item 4. The pattern. The thing that's really most historically problematic about this coat is the coat. The evidence for Viking era coats is pretty scant in general, and when we look at female coated graves, there's even less. This idea of a coat that follows the general construction of a dress and has a plunging neckline closed with a single brooch is a bit of a reenactorism developed to plausibly explain the instance of pins found over sternums in Viking burials. That all said, I never intended this project to be an exploration of very serious experimental archaeology. I like the shape of the coats, and I wanted something a little bit easier to move around in than a cloak. This fabric is pretty and absolutely meets my standard of close enough. And so my darling croissants, grab your cuppa. I will talk about what I am drinking a little bit later. And let's get into it. First things first, I need to draft a cutting layout and transfer it over to the fabric. As I said before, I'm using a modified version of my rectangularly constructed dress pattern with gores only in the sides and a front opening, so this is pretty standard territory. I'm drafting it a bit bigger than normal so I can wear it over clothing and still have a decent amount of ease. I'm positioning the sleeve so that the cuff edges will be the selvage, since the selvage is this wonderful brushy fringe and I want to display that. I did the same thing with the front opening as well. This fabric is very thick and that way I only have to fold the hem over once. Quick pop over to the ironing board to iron out that pesky fold. This fabric takes a pressing beautifully. To the cutting. This last piece is just long enough to make the gores for the sides. I'd like to say that was on purpose, but I try not to lie to my viewers. It just kind of worked out. Don't do what I do, friends. Measure your fabric first. First, I'll sew the front and back together at the shoulders. Normally, I just continue with the construction, but I'm a little worried that I've made the body, and thus the shoulders, too wide. With a more drapey fabric, this mightn't be a problem, but this is very thick and stiff. Yep, too wide. Here I'm cutting off about 2 inches off of each side of the body. And now I can proceed. Next step, sewing the sleeves and underarm gussets. Quick tea break. This magical elixir I mentioned earlier is Once Upon a Time Tea by Fairy Tale Teas, a new Black-owned business that is absolutely killing the ethereal vibe. It's a deliciously warm, sweet blend of black tea, hazelnut, and vanilla cream that comes with or without edible sparkle. And back to work. I'm ironing all the seam allowances flat to make felling them easier. I'm using a similar technique to when I made my cyclists. Instead of machine sewing yarn along the seam allowances with a zigzag stitch, I will instead be felling the seam allowances down with the yarn held along the raw edges to cushion and protect them. And on the advice of all of my wonderful social media croissants, I'm using red to add a pop of color to the inside of this coat. this fabric frays so badly. The individual threads are large and the weave is relatively loose and it just wants to come apart. Were I to make this again, I would immediately zigzag or serge around the edges of each piece before sewing it together. As it is though, I'm trimming off the fraying edges a couple of inches ahead of my felling stitches as I go. Quick try on to make sure the coat fits as intended, which it does, and to mark where the front V-neck closure will need to fall. Have I mentioned that the fabric frays? Time to mark the neckline. Starting with the back, I'm drawing a shallow curve about 1.5 inches deep or so. And then in the front, 2 straight lines from the shoulder seams to the pins marking where the neckline should end. I'm using black twill tape to finish the edges of the neckline. I'll pin the twill tape so that it just overhangs the cut edge of the fabric and sew it down. Then I'll turn the edge under, press, and fell down the tape, enclosing the raw edge. I could have done the same thing with a straight front edge opening, but I just love the way the selvage looks, and I'm glad to preserve that detail by turning it under once and sewing it down with a running stitch that is short on the outside and long on the inside. And now comes the fun part, sewing the trim. I'm folding under the end and sewing it in place since this kind of narrow wear tape tends to fray badly. A theme for this whole project, I guess? And then I'll use red silk thread to sew the tape on with teeny tiny felling stitches. Time to even up the hem. There isn't much to trim up, just the edges of the gores that had to be slightly longer than the front and back to ensure an evenly long hem. With that done, I'll use more twill tape to finish the hem in the same way I finished the neckline: sewing, pinning, pressing, and felling. Here we are, friends, another successful project finished. Am I incredibly, insanely glad I made this coat? Yes. Am I more than likely going to be using it as an actual coat in the real world? Also yes. Am I absolutely going to be making one of these for Tornado to wear this winter? Also yes. Thank you for joining me today. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe, and if you are the kind of person who likes being told when new videos are uploaded, make sure to click the bell to turn notifications on. You can follow me on Instagram and Facebook, and I'll put a link to those in the description, as well as my Ko-fi page if you would like to make a donation to the Alms Purse and help keep Opus Eleni in materials and production assistant Bran in treats. And remember, croissant friends, be kind, do the work, continue supporting marginalized people, and keep creating. Hwyl! Blah, 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 white supremacy, f*** off Nazis.